So let's say you're in the market for a 300ZX because you think you want to 2JZ swap it, and that's a great idea. Or let's say you just bought a 300ZX and the motor that's in it has a ton of issues. It has a ton of oil leaks. It has a ton of vacuum leaks. It needs a timing belt job. And that's going to be a lot of work, and you just want to get it out of there and get a 2JZ. Well, let's find out if that's worth it or not. What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I want to start off this video with thanking every single one of you that have been following along lately. I've been very busy between the 3 cars. I got the CRX finishing up. The FRS turbo build is done. I'm still waiting on parts for the 300ZX, so that's why you haven't seen much on that. But just a little update on all of them. That's what you got. So without further ado, let's get into today's video. We're going to hit you with the reality of the question: is a 2JZ really worth swapping into a Z32? This is going to be a mildly controversial video because so many people feel so strongly about the 2JZ. Now, does it belong in a Z32? That's entirely opinionated. Personally, I don't see a reason. I don't see a point. This motor's plenty strong. The only downside is you got a little bit more to work around and there's less performance parts out there on the market. Obviously, I've chosen to stick with the VG30. I have my reasons. We'll get into that. We'll get you the cost breakdown as best as possible. Now, the prices have gone up of everything, and what typically happens is people will pull apart the car, dive headfirst into the swap without doing as much research as necessary or hoping to cut corners left and right. And you can't really do that because with cars, when you cut corners, it bites you in the end. So they get part way into the swap and then they realize, crap, this is going to cost a lot more money. Crap, this is going to take a lot more work than I thought. And then the car ends up sitting, and then they end up parting it out and it never gets finished. And then you got pieces of a car that was once running just being scattered abroad. I think that's what happened with a lot of 240SXs because the price of those cars started dropping. People started ripping them apart left and right. And then before you know it, you've got junk 240s freaking everywhere. And now they're up, prices are up through the roof because nobody can find a clean one because they've all been gutted and torn apart. Unfortunately, that's the case for, I would say, more than 50% of the swaps out there. Most of them don't ever get finished because of, I would say mostly because of price and time, and a lot of people just don't have the patience for that kind of stuff. And it really helps to have the knowledge or friends that are there to back you up and help you along the way. Now, yes, you can call me a little biased because I do have a Z32. I have been working with the VG30, but I've also seen a lot of 2JZ builds. As a matter of fact, I'm wearing an Induction Performance shirt. If you don't know who they are, look them up. Easily one of the top 2JZ shops probably in the world, at least next to Real Street and Titan Motorsports. They're up there. I'm going to catch a lot of flack on this video. I already know it. It's okay though. So, without further ado, let's get into the nitty gritty. So either way, if you swap it or stick with this motor, you're going to have to replace all the seals. You're going to have to replace all the rubber hoses and possibly a few mechanical components here and there. Timing belts are number 1 for either of these motors. You'll have to worry about that. Speaking from experience, pay close attention to your timing belt. Doesn't matter how long ago it was swapped out, just keep a close eye on it. Now, the thing with these cars is when you see a fast Z32 and somebody opens the hood, the last thing you expect to see is a VG30. You expect it to be LS swapped or 2JZ swapped or maybe even RB26 swapped. But we're not talking about the LS or RB today. We're talking about this motor and the 2JZ because they're both 3 liters and they both make roughly the same power. I would consider the motors very close to equals. However, this motor was thrown under the bus and backed over because the 2JZ made it in the Fast and Furious and this one did not. Anyways, you can make just as much power out of one of these as you can a 2JZ. If you don't believe me, you can look up Devil Z. Ran an 891 with a stock long block motor. From oil pan to valve cover, stock head, stock cams, rods, pistons, everything on the inside was stock. 2 years later, There's a guy in Texas, I think his name's Michael Palladino, ran an 893. Now, I'm not sure how long that motor lasted, but Devil Z had his stock long block in that car running for a good year. Consistent 9.1, 9.2, 9.3. I believe the car is still running to this day in his brother's car. Shout out to Dean and Jordan Maslow for really pushing development on these motors. And I don't think we'd be where we were if it wasn't for guys like him. Now, I believe the factory 2JZ has its record as well as a 896 or 895, somewhere around there. And that is stock bottom end, stock heads, stock cams. Because I know somebody's going to hop on here and say, oh, well, the 2JZs ran 830 or 820 or something like that. They make 1,000 horsepower. You know, every 2JZ makes 1,000 horsepower nowadays. The cars that make 1,000 horsepower have cams and headwork done. Gotta keep that in mind. 2JZ making over 800 horsepower on stock heads and cams. I don't even know. 800 might be possible. 900 definitely not worth it. You need cams at the very least. Same thing with these motors. Now, the biggest difference is with these motors is not too many people will tear into them. They'll upgrade the turbos and they'll call it a day. Once they get to the headwork and cams, for some reason, everybody stops. Nobody wants to put cams in one of these motors. Now, you can get a set of good JWT cams for about $1,100 bucks. If you catch them on sale, they'll be about $950. Now let's talk development. The development of both of these motors have been very different. The 2JZ has all the aftermarket support in the world. The VG30, on the other hand, we've got a couple guys that are developing parts for them still, and that's it. And shout out to those guys that are developing parts. Merlin Machining, Brett Dempsey Engineering, Specialty Z, last but not least, Polar Engineering. All four of those companies are probably making headway on these motors more than any big name company ever has. These motors have been stuck with T25 exhaust manifold flanges since their introduction. The factory manifold flange is a T25. Imagine a Subaru that never rotated its turbo. Until you rotate it, that really opens the door for more power on those motors. Same thing with these motors, I believe anyways. Because we've been stuck with the same T25 flange on the exhaust manifold, we've been stuck with the same turbos. And it's been nothing but cookie cutter builds ever since 1990. Thankfully this year, we've got some V-band turbo manifolds coming out into the market, and I'm freaking excited for that because I've got them on order for this bad boy, and this thing's going to be awesome. So let me get my list out here. Obviously the swap isn't the easiest thing to do. And then once you do the swap, you can run the stock 5-speed transmission. But let's get into the details of the pricing of swapping a 2JZ into the car. I've got a list here that I've taken from a couple of different channels. I'm going to say primarily Calvin Malley. Let's use him for an example because he's probably one of the most well-known 2JZ swap Z32s out there. So with that said, on his channel, he said he spent $10,700 on his swap. Now that's including his CDOO swap, but he didn't include an engine harness, I noticed. So I'm going to go ahead and ditch the CDOO and include the engine harness. I looked up all the prices of everything for today. Now some of these might be plus or minus $100, and you might be able to get something for less or cheaper, but I took the average price of the motor and then some of the swap parts that I would do if I were doing this swap. 2JZ engine. Now this is just the engine, nothing crazy, no turbo, average long block oil pan to valve cover motor. $1,750. I found them ranging anywhere from $1,300 up to $2,000. But that's the average price I was finding these motors at. If you wanted to go through a dealer, like a JDM engine parts dealer, you would probably be spending more than that. Then you have the adapter kit to make the engine and the transmission. The Collins adapter kit is roughly $1,081. Then let's say you want to do a standalone ECU, because you don't want to run the factory ECU on, honestly, either of these motors anymore. It's outdated. Haltech, $1,500 plug and play, $1,500. Wiring specialties harness, $1,200. Wideband O2 for the Haltech, so you can tune for air fuels, another $500. Turbo, we got a GTX 3582, $950. Wastegate and blow-off valve, $300. Again, that's a rough price for a cheaper wastegate and blow-off valve. Personally, I would use Pulsar turbos. I've got Pulsar turbos going on with this. Fuel system, roughly $1,000. That's fuel rail, top feed fuel injectors, fittings. You can cheap out on some of the fittings and get decent Bosch fuel injectors. Total would probably come out to right around $1,000. Radiator, you need a custom radiator to put in one of these, and custom hoses. Roughly $500. I would assume it'd probably be a dual core. You want a good radiator because the motor's going to take up most of the engine bay. So the radiator's probably going to have to be pushed forward and be smaller. So you'd want a dual core, and you want something that'll be able to flow a lot of coolant through it. Radiator fans, you want good fans because you want to be able to cool off the coolant, because Calvin Molly, I don't know if you guys heard, but he was running into a lot of overheating issues with his setup. From there, we've got a clutch, $600, again, give or take. CX Racing intercooler piping, $400. You'd still have to cut and weld and make it work. Custom fab would probably be right around $200 to $300. Intercooler, 4-inch intercooler from CX Racing, roughly $400. That was an average price between the 240SX and the RB26 GTR intercoolers. Timing belt and oil seals, roughly $200. If you go with OEM, it'll probably be more. If you want to change out the tensioner, again, that would be more. But I'm doing just the basic timing belt and oil seals. The downpipe for a 2JZ you can get custom made or buy one online for roughly, I would say, $200 to $300. You could probably get a cheap one. With all that combined, for the 2JZ swap, stock transmission, you have a total of $10,381, and you have a stock motor 2JZ that's completely resealed and a new timing belt with a bigger turbo capable of 600 horsepower. $10,381 for a basic swap. Now, let's jump over to this motor. Let's say you want to make the same amount of power, 650 horsepower, a VG30 without swapping the motor. Anyways, you can get turbo manifolds. AMS turbo manifolds, roughly $450. I wouldn't spend more than that on them. You can get them on sale for way less. All intake piping and intercooler piping. Again, you could probably find this stuff for way less. $1,400, and that's including the intercoolers. Clutch. You get a high 5 putt clutch that'll hold 800 foot-pounds of torque for $650. Pulsar GTX 2860 turbos, 2 of them, for $1,400 for 2 of them. You can get AMS downpipes, 3-inch, $400. Again, fuel injectors and top feed fuel rails. You can do BDE fuel rails and Bosch EV14 injectors, which was my first setup on this motor. Worked really good. Right around $1,000. If you get lucky with the EV14s, you can get them for less. Timing belt and oil seals, again, I had to make it even between the 2 motors. $200. And Haltech plus wideband O2, roughly $2,100. You can run a stock shipped ECU and make 600 horsepower out of it. I would do the Haltech as the first modification to this car if I bought it all over again. Easily one of the best upgrades you can get for it. Total, including the Haltech, is $6,950. If you took the Haltech out, that's $2,000 less, and you'll have an easily 600 horsepower capable car. You can do a lot for very cheap for these. You can do it, you could probably do all this for $4,500 if you really wanted to. This is how I would do it. Again, you can run the factory ECU and you can run side feed injectors. So there's $1,000 for an ECU and injectors. You don't have to worry about the Haltech, you don't have to worry about the top feed fuel rail conversion. Personally, I hate side feed injectors and I hate the factory ECU. So I would get rid of the ECU and get rid of the side feed injectors and go straight to Haltech and straight to top feed fuel rails. I'm not including any of the exhaust. The exhaust components for each motor is going to be different and could vary heavily. I didn't include an intake for the 2JZ because we're swapping to a single turbo. Many people will just throw either a turbo shield on it or a 3-inch pipe with a generic air filter onto that. Okay, so now that pricing is out of the way, let's talk about the strength and longevity of these motors. So with this is obviously the VG30. Unfortunately, I do not have a 2JZ near to compare to. However, I do have a buddy of mine who's building a 2JZ 240 with a big 7675 precision turbo Gen 2. So hopefully, Major, that's you, get your shit finished so we can run these things. It's going to be awesome. So whenever he finishes his car, it'll be a great comparison. Granted, his is a 240 SX, and they're a dime a dozen, and 2JZs are everywhere nowadays. Anyways, so let's talk about the strength of these blocks. Now, this motor is a closed deck iron block, just like the 2JZ. The biggest difference between these motors is that the 2JZ is a Siamese bore. Siamese bore means that there's no coolant running between the bores. Now you might look at this and say, oh wow, you know, there's a lot of meat, there's a lot of metal between those two cylinders. Yes, there is, especially compared to a 2JZ. But this is just on the top surface. Underneath the surface, there's coolant that is allowed to run between the cylinders, making it not a Siamese bore. In the middle, where the coolant runs through, it could rot out potentially and rust away over time, leaving the cylinder walls very weak. And if you do not have a good block, you will crack the cylinders between 3 and 4. And I think it's on the outside cylinders where they typically crack. So I would say roughly 1200 horsepower is the breaking point for the cylinders themselves. Now the other weak point is the main caps. Mazworks just recently started building these motors with billet main caps. You can get a full lawn block assembly with the billet main caps and fully assembled for roughly $5,500, which is very similar to any 2JZ that you would get out there from Induction Performance, Real Street, Titan, so on and so forth. Again, the pricing to build these motors is very similar once you get into the higher horsepower stuff, but the biggest thing is once you get into the 1500 horsepower range, you're going to need to re-sleeve every cylinder, as well as billet mains, and possibly reinforce those billet mains. There's a company out there called Brett Dempsey Engineering, and this guy is just one dude, but he has produced a bed plate for these motors. So not only is it a billet main cap motor, but he also made a bed plate. So a bed plate is the main caps, and there's also a sheet of CNC'd aluminum that goes all the way around the bottom part of the block. So they're reinforced billet main caps bolting into the sides of the motor as well as the main caps. Because on these you really can't do 4-bolt mains. Now you can, it's just very tough and very questionable as to how well it actually works. Hasn't been too much development with 4-bolt mains on these motors. So for the most part they are 2-bolt main, and they do the billet main caps with ARP main studs. That'll get you roughly 1200 horsepower, and then I would say any more than that you will need to re-sleeve the cylinders, and this is crank horsepower, so that comes out to probably roughly 900 horsepower reliably from the bottom end. Anything more than that, it gets pretty questionable because there's not too many people out there making that kind of power on these. The greatest takeaway from all this is that ultimately it's up to you and what best fits your needs. If you're like me, you're doing it on a budget and you want to make good power with as little money as possible, I'm willing to spend the extra time it takes to get this motor up to where it needs to be. I think these are strong motors. I've never had any problems with the motor itself. These are very strong motors. They're very dependable, make great power with a little bit of modification. Are they better than an RB26? Maybe we'll save that for another video. Now, should you and LS swap one of these? We'll save that for another video. I really hope this video helped you guys out if you're looking to do the swap, or you're looking to get a Z32 just to do a 2JZ swap. If you found it enjoyable at all or informational, and maybe I helped you out along the way with your swap, please smash that subscribe button, hit the like button, drop a comment down low if you have any other questions. Follow along as I build my VG30 in my Z32 to reach close to or over 1,000 horsepower. Honestly, I'd like to drive it to the track, run a sub 10 second, high 9 second pass, and drive it back home. But in the meantime, I'm gonna get to work. We'll see you next time. Take care.